Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here to give you another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought today I'd take a position from the endgame from one of my students' games. We've done some king and pawn endgames here in our video channel before, and one of the things I teach everybody is, if nothing else, if you're playing a slow game and you have time on your clock, each move could be extremely critical, and you want to play every move really slow because it's really easy to mess things up and throw away wins, throw away draws by playing too fast in positions where you think you know what to do. So my student got to a position like this with black, and I thought we'd start by going through some of the knowledge that would help you figure out what the right plan and right moves would therefore be. So let's take the knowledge one step at a time. The first question would be, can black just race his pawns down and beat the white king there? And we have a rule which we've talked about in earlier videos called the rule of the square, which is after you push a pawn, and that's the key to the rule of the square. It's after you push the pawn. It's going to be the king's move when you use the square rule. You can't use the square rule when it's the pawn's move. It doesn't work. So after you move the pawn, you take the distance from the pawn to the promoting square, make a perfect square out of it, in this case 4 by 4, and if the king can move into that square, then he can catch the pawn. Alright, so that tells you here that as a first set of information, black just can't push this pawn in and get a queen. The white king can stop it. The second question would be, what happens if black tries to push his pawns together against the white, and the white king just tries to stop him? So let's take a look at that. Suppose black pushes the pawn and white starts to come in, and now black realizes, oh my goodness, if I get a queen, he'll catch me. So he starts to move the other pawn with it. Let's say here. It really doesn't matter. He could push it one more and have the king play here, and now black can play here, and if the king plays here, black can play f4. All right, notice in this position, this is a famous piece of information too, which is the white king can never, when you have two connected passed pawns like this, the white king can never take the pawn that's behind it. Let's say black does nothing here and just kind of moves his king back. Well, it's white's turn. Let's say white takes the pawn. If white ever takes the pawn, then the back pawn, then the forward pawn, and it's not a backward pawn, it's just the back pawn, then the forward pawn just goes in and gets a queen. All right, so now we know a second piece of information. The second piece of information that we know is that we don't really need the king to guard these two pawns. If the king comes over, the black king does not need to guard the pawns. The white king can't take the pawns. They can guard themselves by just being in a similar position to where they are now, with one pawn guarding the other pawn. All right, what else piece of information do we need to know? Well, if we don't do anything for black, let's say black pushes the pawns and then kind of tries to help them with the king, can white create a passed pawn and win the game by himself if the black king is not over there? So this is going to be the third piece of information. So for instance, suppose, again, we try this kind of stuff and then we realize, oh, we're not going anywhere, and we bring the king up, and white pushes a pawn, and we bring the king up, and white pushes the pawn, and he checks, and the king comes back, and let's say you play pawn here, and white plays here, and black plays here, and white plays here. Black takes, white takes. We can see that check, black goes back. Let's say black plays here now. If white plays c7 in this position, he'll get a queen, but black will play king f3 and then checkmate. For instance, pawn c7, king here, c8 queen, checkmate. So it is possible that all offense would win, but suppose black now plays, instead of white playing c7, suppose white plays king to g2. Well, now it's too late to come back. If black does nothing, white will just get a queen. So black's only try in this position would be to come up here and try to queen the pawn. So black would play here, white plays here, black plays here, white gets a queen, black gets a queen check, white takes off the pawn, and black doesn't have a checkmate here. Maybe he could win this pawn with a check, but this is clearly not an easy win for black. In fact, now that both sides have queen, it's most likely going to be a draw, but this is not what black's trying to do. So now we have a third piece of information. Let's review what they are. The first piece is black can't just push the pawn in. The second piece of information is these two pawns don't need the king guarding them. If they just stay where they are, they move up a little and guard each other, then white can never take the back pawn there because the front pawn will get a queen. The third piece of information we have is if black does nothing, then white can play b4, c5, b5, and c6 and get a passed pawn. And if the black king is too far away, then white can win. All right, so now we have those three pieces of information. What can we do with them to put them together to form the idea of what black should do? Well, the first thing we kind of learn from that is that with the black king doesn't need to guard these pawns, and secondly, in the line where he tries to help these pawns get a queen and he ignores the white pawns, the white pawns just go marching in and get a promote the pawn. This tells us where we eventually want the black king to go. It tells us that we want the black king at some point to be on the queen side. How did we arrive at that? Well, we just saw that if black does nothing, white can create a passed pawn on that side of the board with his majority, and he can promote the pawn and get a queen. We also saw that black doesn't need to guard his pawns with his king, and we also saw that if he plays 100% offense and just lets white's pawns come down the board, then that might not be fast enough to win. All those things put together tell you that the king needs to be on the queen side, and probably the sooner the better, because if you wait and white starts getting those passed pawns, it could be a problem. All right, so that tells us that one candidate idea here is to just simply march the king over the queen side. All right, but do you have to do that right away on the first move? Is there any other first moves that would make any sense? Well, we already saw pushing the pawn probably doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't help you that much because whether the pawns are stuck here or stuck back here, it doesn't matter as long as the black king can win these pawns. So that would hint to us that maybe we don't want to spend tempos pushing the pawns. We want the tempos to bring the king over as soon as possible. Is there any way we can hold up doing that? Well, there is one move that black could play that would not be a waste of tempo that might help his king coming over. And that is a5. Okay, now let's assume for the sake of argument that we play a5 and the white goes ahead and he tries to create the passed pawn. Let's say white first moves the king over and brings the king in, and now all of a sudden he decides to push the pawns. Well, he's not going to be able to create a passed pawn here. If he plays f5, c5, then after king d7, we don't need to guard this pawn. If he ever takes it, we just go in and get a queen. After c5, king here, if white does nothing, black's just going to pick up this pawn because it's loose. So that doesn't work. All right? Suppose white sacrifices that pawn to get a 2-on-1 majority. Well, that's not going to do much good either, because if white tries to push that majority, let's say he plays pawn here, not only can black go down and try to queen with check, but he can just get his king in the area, and when the two pawns try to come up against the one, the king's going to be right there, and there's not going to be any sacrifice to win. Suppose white tries that a little bit earlier. Suppose white brings the king up, and when the king comes here, he tries playing here right away. And pawn takes, and now he says, I'll push this pawn. All right, can white, this pawn and this pawn against the one pawn, beat these three pawns? And the answer is no. Okay, black has several ways he could do this. Let's try some. He could just push this pawn till the king takes it and then push this pawn. So pawn here, king here, pawn here, king here, just to get the king outside the box. and now pawn here, and now pawn here, and let's say pawn here. Okay, black takes, white pushes, black goes, white pushes. Black finally gets a queen, and white gets a queen, and we have a queen against 2 pawns, which should win. It's black's turn. But again, this is a little more difficult than what we want. So let's go back and look at that again. We're trying to figure out if black has time to play a5. a5, if white tries to bring his king in, king here, and now pawn here, pawn takes, c5. Let's see if black can just bring the king back. King here, he's still, let's say he tries pushing the pawn right away. Then pawn takes, and here's the pawn, and he's outside the square. What can black do about that? Well, he could start with, well, let's let the computer find the most efficient way to do this. Let me make this window a little bit smaller so we can see the engine analysis. All right. Gets tricky if you try to do it this way. I'm trying to convince you that black really doesn't want to get into something like this, but all right, let's bring the window back. Just trying to fit it back in for you. Okay, we'll make it a little bigger. All right, so Mr. Stockfish, what's the best way to play this for black once white makes that sacrifice? Stockfish says black's winning, but it's something like g4, a6, b3, king c3, g3, a7, g2, a8 queen, g1 queen, and king takes b3, and we get the same positions before, the queen and 2 pawns against the queen. All right, so we can see that white might be able to sacrifice against that and get in. So if black plays a4 first and white plays king here, it's probably better for black here to let's let the engine show you the best way. You push the pawn. If the king comes over, you bring the king up. If he tries to push the pawns, king g5. And now if he pushes this pawn, you take it. He tries to play here again. b3, he tries to catch it. And now you're going to get a queen before he does. For instance, if he plays c6 here, takes, and a3, now we can actually, on king c2, pawn here, we have a little trick. We can promote the pawn, king takes, and we get a queen with check. And when he gets out of check, we can take the pawn, and he doesn't get a queen. All right, so we're looking at the line a5, king here, followed by b4. And we see that there are some tricks, but black is winning, but not so easily as what we thought. Okay, can black do better? Well, the answer is he doesn't have to play a5. All right, we could also look at the line where he plays a5 and white says, why should I play b4 when I can't take it? Let's play it when I can take it. And he plays b4 right away. Well, again, black has multiple ideas, but he can push the pawn and get the king away from that square. Because if white now tries to take the pawn, he's outside the box and it's way too slow in this race. So if he pushes the pawn and white now comes up, pushes the pawn, king comes back. Now we take here, and again, we're in the same kind of race where by the time these pawns create a passed pawn, one of these pawns is going to get a queen, and that doesn't work. So after a5, b4, g4, that distracts the king away from this pawn, so that's why pushing that pawn right away won't work. So what we're seeing now is a5 will win for black, but there are some tricky lines. Let's let the engine play best for both sides here, just to show you. All right, so a5, it gives king d2, g4, king e3, king g6, king d4, king f5, king e3, king e5. This is getting to be an easy win now. c5, f5, and he doesn't have any past pawns. Black's just going to come over and pick off the pawns and win. Okay, so we've seen a5, king d4, and we've seen if black doesn't play g4, if he plays king g7, maybe b4, a takes b4, c5. Well, the engine thinks a5 is a little more accurate. g4, pawn push, g3, king e3, and now we have that b3 idea again. So even though the king's tempo loss really wasn't helpful to bring the king over here, black's going to win with the idea of queening one of these pawns first. For instance, if we just saw, for instance, a6, pawn takes here, and now pawn here, here, pawn queens, queen e1 check, king d3, queen f1 check, king c2, and black's winning with the 3 pawns. Okay, so yes, if black wants to play a5 and then kind of never move his king, if black plays a5 and white moves his king over, and white just keeps moving the king over, and lets black come over this way, then this is going to be a trivial win. You know, black's just going to bring his king up to b4 and take off all the pawns and win the game. So that's the purpose of a5, is if white doesn't try to get tricky and do anything, when you play a5, it makes the resulting endgame. If white does nothing, this is trivial win. That's why I kept showing you that white has to try to sacrifice that pawn. Now, what does that all mean? Well, it means if you're really careful and you do your analysis and you calculate that a5 wins, then you can play a5 here, but you have to calculate it. You can't just do it on general principles that it makes the pawn backward and it makes the king and pawn endgame easy if white does nothing. But let's now suppose that black doesn't play a5. Suppose he just does the original plan that I talked about and brings the king over. King over, king here, king over. Let's say white's now afraid that black will play a5 if he moves the king too far. For instance, king here, pawn here wins easily. So let's say at this point white now plays b4. King here, king here, king here, king here. And now what should black do? Well, there's a famous move here. What you play in these kind of positions is to play, and this is what makes it really easy. Let's make the board a little bigger here so you can see. Whenever you get to a position like this, rather than trying to bring your king around and take off the pawns by deflecting the king or anything, you just play a5. All right, and now the game is over. If white plays check, black just plays king c6, threatening to take the pawn. If white takes the pawn, you just take back, and then you come over and you pick off all these pawns. If white plays b5, you just play king c5. White has nothing to do. You take the pawn, you come over and you take both these pawns. All right, so let's go back and look at that. King g7, king d4, king f7, b4, king e6, king e4, king d6, king f5, a5, the key move, and the game's over. There's nothing he can do. If he takes the pawn, he just loses all his pawns. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that white should have to play a5 here to beat this. All right, so now we're learning a little. King here, king here, king here, pawn here, king here, and instead of king over, white should play pawn here. Or maybe king here first, and if black... Well, even now, black can play a5. So let's play a5 for white. King here, king here. Okay, now this is a lot harder because black doesn't have the a5 move to break up white's pawns. All right, so there's a couple ways to do this now, but again, let's let the engine show us what's the most efficient. If you learn how to win a position like this, then you can win anything because this is pretty much the best defense that white could possibly play against our original plan of just bringing the king to the queen side. All right, Mr. Engine, let's turn you on. What should black play here? Well, First, the engine wants to move the pawns up 1 to deflect the king. So g4, king f5, f5, king g3 is forced. All he can do is go back and forth. He can never take this pawn. Notice he can't push the pawns either. If he plays b5, then king here wins this pawn and wins all the pawns because white can never get through. If he pushes one of these pawns, it just gets locked up. So he can't play b5. He can't play c5 check because after king here, there's nothing he can do again. If he moves the king back, black just plays a6, king here, and takes off all the pawns. If instead of playing king g3, white sacrifices this pawn with a6, black will just take. White goes back and forth, and now black plays this break move and breaks up the pawns. White has no choice. If he takes, black takes and then picks up this pawn and gets a queen. So he can't do anything with the pawns. Once we get to this position, white has to play king to g3. Alright, and now the question is, does black need to push his pawns or can he just bring his king around and pick off the pawns? And again, you have to be careful and calculate these things. The engine says, yes, you now have time to bring your king up. Again, he can't push the pawns. Pawn here, king here wins instantly. Pawn here, king here wins instantly because he can't play here, you take. And if he plays any other move, you play a6 and then you come around and pick off all the pawns. So after king e5, white could try, let's say, a6. But now, again, you have this idea of you take, and white, let's say, pushes the pawn. You bring the king back. He brings his king back. You bring your king back. He waits. And now you break up the pawns again with this move. And if he takes, you take here, come over, take off the pawn, and you win. All right, so he can't do that either. So what can he do? Well, we already said if he plays c5, you can play king to d5 and then play a6 and win. Let's say he just moves the king back to f2. But now you can go to king d4 and hit this pawn. And if he plays pawn here, then you can, the easiest win is not to play pawn here, because then he plays here and you have to figure things out, and the answer is, yeah, you could just take the pawn and win. So a6 does win if you calculate correctly, but don't take this pawn and let him push here, and all of a sudden, black's in trouble. White's going to queen first. It's easy to lose if you play it too fast. But no, instead, if he pushes this pawn, you have to take here. All right? Or, instead, when it's black's turn here, you can just play king back to d5 and come around. Notice you can't play here the obvious move. Why not? Because white's going to play this move. a6. This is where people lose games because they play it too fast. And I watch people going, well, I thought I was just winning. Well, yes, but if you actually stopped and calculated, maybe you'd see that he has an easy sacrifice to win the game. So you could still lose the game here by playing a silly move like king here. We just saw that a6 wins, but the easiest win is to, now that he's pushed this pawn, is to bring the king back inside the square. Well, if he plays a6 now, we already went over this. Pawn takes. He can't really do anything. King here, pawn here wins. If you play king here and he pushes the pawn, well, you just take it and you win. Let's say he does nothing. He plays king here. Now you could play either a6 or king c6. Let's say king c6, king here, and now pawn here. Again, you don't want to play king here and king takes pawn. That falls for that trick again. Pawn here, pawn takes, pawn here wins for white. It's easy to lose these games if you don't know. But right here, when black goes there, if white plays king g3, not king takes b4, but a6. And now you can take this pawn. He doesn't have any of those sacrifices, and you win. So let's go through that line again. King g7, king d4, king f7, b4, g4, king e4, f5 check, well, I guess we had the line first where white plays a5, and then f5, then king e3, king e7, king f4, king here, and now white's in a little bit of zugzwang. He can't play b5 because of king c5. He can't play c5 check because of king c6. He can't play a6 because of pawn takes pawn, followed by king c6 and a5. So he has to move the king. He has to go back. King here threatening to come in. At some point, white's going to have to push. He could actually wait a move. He could wait here, here, and now push. And now a6 does win if you're careful. King d5 wins, but king c4 loses to this move. Easy to lose, but king d5 is the right way around to come this way. And now you come here, and now here, and now you can't take the pawn because of a6, but you simply play a6 yourself. He waits, and now you take off all his pawns, and you can get 4 queens if you want. Well, not 4, you can only get 3 because he can always take this pawn, and you win. So now we see, with all that knowledge, what the right idea is for black. Black has basically 2 ways to win. He could play a5 and calculate that in some very clever lines he can queen first, but it takes a little bit of calculation. Or black could say, let me just bring the king over. I'll get his king out of the way, and if white plays this, which is the best setup that he can get, then I'll play here. He's in a little bit of zugzwang. He really can't push any of the pawns. He has to play here. I'll play here. He'll wait. I'll attack his pawn. He goes here. And now I got to come this way. I could still lose. King here. King here. King here. King here. King here. King back. And now I have to play this move a6. King here. King takes pawn, and I win. All right, so that's it. So black is winning. He could win by pushing the pawns first, but then at some point he's got to bring the king over. He could win by playing a5 first, but he has to be very careful in calculating. Or he could just bring the king over, and once he realizes all those bad lines where white can sacrifice a pawn and queen first, if he just avoids those lines and he brings his king around carefully, he should win every time. So if you saw my earlier video, king and 5 pawn against king and 4, this is one step more difficult. In that video, black was just up a pawn, but white had no majority anywhere. Black had a 3-on-2 majority, and it was also 2-on-2 on the other side, so we didn't have to worry about stuff like this. This is one step harder. Here, black has a 2-on-0 majority, but white has a 3-on-2, and you can't just ignore the 3-on-2. You have to be able to get around and get to it. So this is kind of the next step up in the king and pawn endgames. But once you learn these ideas in these king and pawn endgames, and you see what the tricks are, and you see how you could lose if you go bad, again, we never want you to play fast. We want you to calculate. And if your opponent is clever and has seen these patterns, he's not going to give up. He's going to wait and see if you play the right move order, and if you don't, maybe even white can win. All right, but studying these videos gives you an idea of what can go on in these king and pawn endgames. And once you get an idea of the right patterns and the right tricks, then you should be fine, because these endgames where you're just up a clear pawn are almost always wins unless your opponent's just getting a queen right away and beating you. But of course, you have to be able to play it carefully. You just can't play anything and win. And when you get to these endgames, as I said earlier, the one thing you really can't do is play all your moves fast. Even if you're a good player, you don't want to play these moves fast. It's just too easy to go one step in the wrong direction and throw away a whole game that you're winning. And then people take lessons from me and they say, oh, I was winning the endgame and the computer said I was winning and I played fast and I went the wrong way and I lost or I drew or whatever. Well, that should never happen. You know, if you have the time, you got to take it. Best thing you can do is tell your friends about our video channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you'd like to like the video, great, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, love to have you as a subscriber. I think this is video number 198. 2 more to go before we get to our magic 200 number. See you then. Bye.